Alright folks, I'm going to try something a little bit different today. I've been wanting to read a book online just to get started, just to have a book out there that people could listen to when they felt like logging onto YouTube and listening to a book. So I didn't know what to do. I'm a big fan of Russian literature. I've read a bit of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and there's two other big names in the Russian literature world. There's, of course, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I've read a bit of him. I should probably read more. He's probably more timely. He probably has more relevant things. Well, of course, if you're a good novelist, everything you say is relevant, but politically and just emotionally, Solzhenitsyn's probably a lot more timely for this day and age. But the other one, Maxim Gorky, which is just a pen name, I have not read any of his books. This one is called My Childhood. It's the first of three. I think it's a semi-autobiographical. It's a semi-autobiographical look at his life growing up. So the second one is My Apprenticeship, and then the third one is My Adulthood, something pertaining to adulthood, maybe adulthood. So anyway, I'm just going to get right into it. Hopefully it's entertaining enough to keep me reading and to keep you listening. And hopefully we'll learn a thing or two from this renowned novelist. So, let's get right to it. Father lay on the floor by the window of a small darkened room, dressed in white and looking terribly long. His feet were bare and his toes were strangely splayed out. His gentle fingers, now peacefully resting on his chest, were also distorted, and the black discs of copper coins firmly sealed his once shining eyes. His kind face had darkened, and its nastily bared teeth frightened me. Mother, half naked in a red skirt, was kneeling beside him, combing his long, soft hair down from the forehead to the nape of his neck, with the black comb I loved to use as a saw for melon rinds. She kept muttering something in a hoarse, deep voice. Her gray eyes were swollen and seemed to be dissolving in a flood of tears. Grandmother was holding me by the hand. She was a fat, round woman with a large head, enormous eyes, and a funny, puffy nose. All black and soft, she was terribly fascinating. She was crying as well. Her voice pitched differently from Mother's, but in a way that perfectly harmonized with it. Shaking all over, she pulled and pushed me over to Father. I stubbornly resisted and tried to hide behind her, for I felt frightened and out of place there. I'd never seen grown-ups crying before, and couldn't make head or tail of the words Grandma repeated again and again. Say goodbye to your father. You won't ever see him again, dear. He died too young, before his time. I'd been very ill and had only just started walking again. During my illness, and this I remember very clearly, Father had light-heartedly played games with me and kept me amused. And then he suddenly disappeared, and a new person, Grandmother, took his place. "Where did you walk down from?" I asked her. She answered, "From up the river, from Nizhny. But I didn't walk, I came by boat. You can't walk on water. Enough of your questions now." This I found both funny and puzzling. Upstairs in the house lived two bearded Persians, while the cellar was occupied by an old sallow-faced Kalmuk who sold sheepskins. I could slide down the banisters or somersault down if I fell off. That was an accepted fact. But what did water have to do with it? It all seemed wrong and ludicrously mixed up. And why should I be quiet? "Because you've always too much to say for yourself," she said, laughing. The way she spoke was warm and cheerful, rhythmical. We became firm friends from the very first day, and now I wanted both of us to get out of that room as soon as possible. Mother's presence had a stifling effect on me, and her tears and wailing awakened an unfamiliar feeling of anxiety in me. I'd never seen her like that before. She had always been stern with me and was given to few words. She was clean and smooth. She was a clean, smooth, large person, like a horse. She had a firm body and extremely strong hands, and now she looked unpleasantly swollen and disheveled. All her clothes were torn, Her hair, which was usually neatly combed into place like a large gray hat, was scattered over her bare shoulders and hung over her face, and some of it, in the form of a large plait, dangled about, touching Father's sleeping face. For all the time I'd been standing in that room, not once did she so much as look at me, but just went on combing Father's hair, choking with tears and howling continually. Some dark-skinned peasants and a local constable peered round the door. "Hurry up and get him out of here," the constable shouted angrily. A dark shoal had been used as a curtain over the window, and swelled out like a sail. Once Father had taken me sailing, and suddenly there was a thunderclap. Father had laughed, pressed me firmly between his knees, and shouted, "It's nothing. Don't be frightened, Alex." Suddenly Mother lifted herself heavily from the floor, then fell down on her back so that her hair brushed over the floor. Her unseeing pale face had gone blue. Baring her teeth like Father's, she said in a terrifying voice, "Close the door. Get Alexei out of here." Grandmother pushed me aside as she made for the door. "Friends, don't be afraid," she cried. "Don't touch her, and go away for Christ's sake. It's not Gloria. She's in labor. Please go away." I hid in a dim corner behind a trunk, and looking from there at Mother writhing over the floor, groaning and gnashing her teeth, while Grandmother crawled round her and said in a gentle, joyful voice, "In the name of the Son and the Holy Ghost, try and bear the pain. Veryusha, Holy Mother of God, who prays for us." I was frightened out of my wits. There they were, rolling over the floor, knocking up against Father's body, groaning and shouting. He didn't move and seemed to be laughing. This went on for a long time, and several times Mother got to her feet, only to fall down again. Grandmother kept rolling in and out of the room like a big soft ball. Suddenly a baby cried in the darkness. "God be praised," said Grandmother, "a boy." And she lit a candle. I must have dozed off in a corner, as I don't remember anything more. Another vivid experience that stands out in my memory is a rainy day in a deserted corner of a cemetery. I stood on a slippery heap of sticky mud and looked down into the pit where my father's coffin had been lowered. At the bottom was a lot of water and a few frogs. Two of them had succeeded in climbing on to the yellow coffin lid. My grandmother, myself, a policeman who looked soaked to the skin, and two men with spades were evidently in a very bad mood. Had gathered round the grave. A warm rain, as fine as delicate beads, began to fall gently on us. "Fill it in," said the policeman, as he walked away. Grandmother burst into tears and hid her face in her shawl. The grave diggers bent double and began piling the earth into the grave at great speed. Water squelched. The frogs jumped off the coffin and tried to escape up the sides, but were thrown back by the clods of earth. "Let's go now, Lenya," said Grandmother as she put her hand on my shoulder, reluctant to leave. I slipped out of her grasp. "God help us," she grumbled, not at me or even at God, and she stood by the grave for a long time, quite silent. Even when the grave had been leveled off, she still stood there. The grave diggers smacked their spades against the mud, which made them ring with a hollow sound. A sudden gust of wind drove away the rain. Grandmother took my hand and led me to a distant church, surrounded by a great number of dark crosses. "Why don't you cry?" she asked when we left the cemetery. "You ought to cry." "I don't want to," I replied. "Well, you better not if you don't want to," she said softly. I found this very strange. When I did cry, which wasn't often, it was usually because of some insult, and not from physical pain. My father always laughed at me, but Mother would shout, "Don't you dare cry." Afterwards we rode in a droshky along a broad and very muddy street lined with houses, painted deep red. I asked Grandmother, "Will the frogs get out?" "No, they don't stand a chance. God help them." Neither my mother nor my father ever mentioned the name of God so often and with such familiarity. A few days later we were all traveling in a small cabin on board a steamboat. My newly born brother, Maxim, had died and lay on a table in the corner, wrapped up in a white sheet tied round with a red ribbon. I clambered up onto the piles of luggage and trunks and looked out over the porthole, which was round and bulging like a horse's eye. Beyond the wet glass, the swirling, foaming water stretched away endlessly. At times it seemed to rear up and lick the glass, making me jump back up onto the floor. "Don't be frightened," said grandmother as she gently lifted me into her soft arms and put me back on the pile of luggage. A gray, damp mist hung over the water. Somewhere in the distance, a dark mass of land would loom up and then disappear. Everything around me was shaking. Only my mother, who was leaning against a wall, her hands behind her head, stood firm and steady. Her face clouded over, grimly set, and with the eyes shut tight, was that of a blind person. Not once did she speak. She seemed to have changed into something else, something strange and new. Even her dress was different. Grandmother asked her over and over again in a soft voice, in the soft voice she had, "Varya, dear, try and eat something, won't you?" My mother didn't reply and remained motionless. Grandmother used to whisper to me. With my mother she raised her voice, but all the same approached her timidly and cautiously, saying very little. It struck me that she was afraid of her. This I could well understand, and I felt all the closer to my grandmother. "Saratov," my mother exclaimed in an unexpectedly loud and angry voice. "Where's that sailor got to?" The words Saratov and sailor were very strange and foreign sounding. A broad-shouldered, gray-haired man dressed in blue came into the cabin. He carried a small box. Grandmother took it from him and began to lay out my brother. When she had finished, she took the box in her outstretched arms to the door, but she was far too fat to get through the narrow doorway, except sideways, and her confusion and embarrassment made me laugh. "Oh, Mother," my mother cried and took away the coffin. They both disappeared, leaving me staring at the man in blue. "What has your brother gone?" he said, leaning towards me. "Who are you?" "A sailor." "And who is Saratov?" "Saratov's a town. Look out the window there." Through the window, I could see the land slipping by. It was dark and steep, and the mist rose from it in smoky rings, reminding me of a large slice of bread freshly cut from the loaf. "And where's grandmother gone?" "To bury her grandson." "Will they put him in the ground?" "Of course. How else can they bury him?" I told the sailor about the frogs buried alive with my father. He lifted me in his arms and gave me a firm hug and kissed me. "You're too young to understand," he said. "You don't have to be sorry for the frogs. To hell with them. It's your mother you should pity. See what life's done to her?" Suddenly something hooted and roared above. I knew very well that it was the ship, and I wasn't at all afraid. But the sailor hurriedly put me down and rushed off, saying, "I've got to run." I wanted to run as well. I went out of the cabin. The dim, narrow gangway was empty. Near the door, copper plates glinted on the ladder steps. I looked up and saw people with knapsacks and bundles. Clearly everybody was leaving the ship, and that meant I had to go too. When I found myself in the middle of a crowd of men by the rail, just in front of the gangway, everyone started shouting at me. Who do you belong to? Where did you come from?" "I don't know," I said. For a long time I was shoved around and shaken and poked, and at last the gray-haired sailor appeared on the scene and seized me. "He's the boy from one of the cabins, from Astrakhan," he explained. He ran with me into the cabin, dumped me on a pile of luggage, and pointed a menacing finger at me as he left. "Don't you dare move." The noise up above gradually died down. The ship was steadily throbbing now and no longer pitched and tossed through the water. Something that looked like a wet wall shut out the light of the porthole. The cabin became dark and stuffy, and the bundles of luggage seemed to swell up, crowding me and making me feel cramped and ill at ease. Perhaps I'd been left alone on that empty ship for good. I went to the door but couldn't budge the copper handle. I caught hold of a bottle of milk and smashed it against the handle as hard as I could. The milk drenched my legs and